Thank you for all coming today. On our keynote speech the other night that Ann Douglas gave, she said, most of us, when we think of film noir, we think of post 1945, but she was saying we need to bring it back at least to 1939, and there's some evidence we could even start film noir earlier than that. And I would suggest that for many of the Hollywood studio heads, producers, and writers, the post-war sense of dread, of corrupt cops, of nobody being who they seem to be, of government officials turning a blind eye, and finally of simply corruption unabated. That seemed to characterize the post-war, and I would argue all this was happening in Hollywood in the 1930s. And so what I want to tell you is not a direct link saying everything I'm talking about today it directly leads to film noir. But the old saw is good writers write about what they know, they write about what they've experienced. So I want to talk to you about what's going on in Hollywood from 1933 through the war, at least through Pearl Harbor. And the first thing is, imagine, we know that despite I was just talking with Jane Gaines, despite the Hollywood New Museum, the Academy Museum, that seems to have forgotten its early history, Hollywood was dominated by Jews. And imagine you are Jewish or you are a politically aware person walking through Los Angeles. This is what it looks like. Everything in red, I know it's hard to read, is either a Nazi or fascist organization in LA. And everything in blue are Jewish areas. I could not fit all the Nazi and fascist groups in downtown LA, or you never would have seen any street signs. That's how dominant it was. If you take a look at the top image here, that is not Nazi Germany. That is on Figueroa and West 15th Street in Los Angeles. It's now part of the Convention Hall parking lot, but this was Deutsche House, celebrating Hitler's birthday. And on the bottom, what you see are Nazi flags in downtown Los Angeles on Broadway Street. This is what people were watching, walking through, living through. The story I want to tell you today starts in July 1933, when Nazis, who then called themselves the Friends of New Germany, held their first open meeting in Los Angeles. And at that meeting, they promised the Angelinos they were going to save America from its two greatest threats, Jews and communists, which everyone knew were really one and the same. And at the end of the evening, they had several hundred people sign up to join the Friends of New Germany. Now, after the meeting was over, a photographer, newspaper photographer, asked 5 of the Nazis to pose for a picture here, and they are dressed in their stormtrooper uniforms with the swastika armband. But what's most important is something at the very end of this article that's in yellow here that says, the Friends of New Germany have opened their hall. They are headquarters at the Alt-Heidelberg Inn, and they have opened the basement to any veteran, German or American of World War I. Doesn't matter what side you fought on. If you are homeless and you need a place to stay, we will give you a cot, we will give you food, we'll give you hot water, whatever you need. And all you have to do in return is listen to the Minister of Propaganda explain what is going on in the new Germany. Well, for many Angelinos who looked at this picture, many of them thought of these Nazis as either thugs or Keystone cops. And I would say they were neither. And in fact, don't look at the stormtrooper uniforms. This is what mattered, that the Nazi leadership in Los Angeles and the Nazi leadership in New York weren't walking around wearing brown shirts and swastikas. They wanted to appear respectable, and they looked like ordinary businessmen. They wore suits, they wore ties. Here is Captain Robert Pape, who was sent by Hitler and his men, by Hitler and his men to start Nazi
units. Again, they would call them the Friends of New Germany, all along the Pacific coast. And here are his two early main lieutenants, Hans Winterhalter, who was the Minister of Propaganda, and Paul Themlis, who was both the number 2 man early on in Los Angeles and also ran the Aryan bookstore. Now, when that article came out, there was one Angelino who understood that the offer of help in the basement was no offer at all. In fact, what the Nazis were doing is trying to build a brown shirt army in LA in the early 30s in the same way Hitler's men had done it in Munich in the 1920s. And the person who understood this was Leon Lewis. Who is Leon Lewis? Someone you've never heard of. Born in Wisconsin in 1889 to Jewish German immigrant parents. He went to public school, then went to George Washington for college, and went to the University of Chicago for law school. He graduated in 1913, and rather than go work for a commercial firm, he believed in the Hebrew concept of tikkun olam, of healing the world. And he went to work for a brand new group that was just starting out called the Anti-Defamation League. And he was their founding executive secretary. There were only 3 of them. 2 years later, in addition to monitoring all anti-Semitic activities in the United States, he was given the job of being the ADL's representative to the Hollywood studio heads. And so starting in 1915, he established close relationships with all the studio heads. World War I comes, he goes off and he serves. He refused to go in as an officer. He went in as a private, but wound up as a major by the time he left. He also stayed on after the war's end doing aid work through London. And when he came back, he told his 2 companions that this was just the beginning, that he saw fascism beginning to emerge in the post-war era, and that they needed to start a new division, the international division. And for any of you who've ever been part of an organization, if you come up with a really good idea, not just an idea, a really good idea for something new, guess who gets asked to run it? That's right. So now Leon Lewis is both the executive secretary for national affairs and international. But he had been gassed during World War I, and by 1930, he has to move to a better climate, and he moves to Los Angeles. He establishes his law practice there. The ADL doesn't want to lose him, so they make him both the Southern California representative of ADL, but they've asked him to continue being the ADL's chief liaison with the studio heads. January 1933, Adolf Hitler comes to power. And there's a lot of scholarship that says, Hitler comes to power and Jews just don't do much. Well, that's not true. Jews did quite a bit. The problem is they disagreed on their strategy. Should we get in Hitler's face and really pressure him, which is what the American Jewish Congress and Rabbi Stephen Wise wanted to do, or should we follow the model of the American Jewish Committee, which said, don't get in the Hitler's face, he'll just double down on you and make it worse for the Jews. Go through ministers and religious leaders. Well, they can't agree on anything. And once the Nazis open up their first public meeting and do well, Leon Lewis says, enough, no one is doing anything, I'm going to do something. He is a veteran, and so he goes a few blocks south, maybe half a mile south of downtown. Is a place called Patriotic Hall, built by the county supervisors in the late 20s to house all the veteran groups. And he recruits 4 men and 2 of their wives who agree to go undercover and join every Nazi and fascist group in Los Angeles, to be agent provocateurs, to rise to positions of power, and to try to dismantle those groups from within. And the first and most important spy he gets is John Schmidt. John Schmidt was born in Germany. His father was a general who had received the Iron Cross. His brother was a high-ranking officer in the German army. He was a German military cadet till the age of 16 and then ran away to America, lied about his age, joined the army, and fought with General Pershing in Mexico. and then went to Europe with the American Expeditionary Forces to fight his own family in World War I. He hated Hitler, he hated what was doing to Germany, and he immediately agreed that he and his wife would join as many groups as they could. He then persuaded Carl Sunderland, who had spent his career in the military as well, in the cavalry. Sunderland came from a German background, and he never told the Nazis that he actually understood German. Couldn't speak it well, but understood it pretty well, so they would speak in front of him, thinking that he was just another dumb American who knew nothing. He and his wife rose up within the Nazi party there. Major C. Bert Allen, and finally, his only Jewish spy in the entire time he ran the operation, who he used only for one night, and that was Colonel William Conley. Why? Because first of all, he doesn't look Jewish, and second, Conley was the head of the National Commander of the Disabled American Veterans, who was touring the country denouncing FDR in Congress. Why? Because when FDR took over on March 1st, 1934, the first thing he and Congress did was pass the Budget Act, the Economy Act of 1934, which cut military benefits. People had been receiving $20 to $100 a month, and it cut it to $20 max, and in many cases, nothing at all. You had a lot of angry veterans all running around there. And in part of the fear is there were more veterans, World War veterans, living in Southern California than anywhere else in the United States, over 150,000 just in LA County, and then added probably another 100,000 in San Diego. Plus LA, the largest ethnic group in the city, 150,000 Germans. The next largest group was about 70,000. So Leon Lewis knew this was a real threat. He asked his men to find out what's going on and come back to me with, if you can get evidence, that would be great. And it's a good thing they did, because over the next few weeks, they met a man who had been part of Hitler's brown shirt group in the 1920s and had to flee Germany after he had shot 2 Jews to death. He winds up in San Francisco. He joins the National Guard there, and while he's a Guard member, he makes a blueprint of the entire armory there. Where is the munitions kept? Where's the heavy military weapons kept? Where are the officers' quarters? Where are the enlisted men? He then goes down to San Diego, and he works with fascists there, both with Nazis there, who are also part of Friends of New Germany, and there are American compatriots, a group called the Silver Shirts, who were formed the day after Hitler became Reichschancellor of Germany. The founder William Dudley Pelley said that if a painter can become the head of Germany, I can form American army here. And they are conspiring, the Silver Shirts with the Nazis, and then he goes to LA and he meets with 3 of the spies that Leon Lewis has recruited, and he says, I need your help. And they meet in a hotel. First they meet at the Alt Heidelberg, they have meals together, they begin to trust one another, and he says, I need your help. That we're going to, on this coordinated day, we are going to have Nazis, Silver Shirts, and then every German boat that docks, whether along the Pacific or along the Atlantic, has a small detachment of Gestapo troops on it. Those 3 groups are going to get together. They're going to seize the armories in LA, San Francisco, San Diego at the same moment. They will capture all the troops and they will offer them the choice. Do you want to join us in saving America from the Red Menace? Everyone who said yes would be welcome into their new fascist army. Everyone who said no would be shot on the spot. And so the 3 men said, what do you need from us? And he said, well, I need machine gun and I need the blueprints for the armory. Well, unbeknownst to him, Leon Lewis had set up a dictaphone in that hotel room and had hard evidence. And he had now accumulated enough real evidence to go to the LA police chief, Remember, Leon Lewis is a lawyer, and what he thought is, I don't know how to run a spy operation. No one's doing anything, so I'll start it. And once I get evidence, I'll turn it over to the authorities, and they know what to do, except for one small problem. He walks into Police Chief Two Gun Davis, known as Two Gun, because for several years in a row, he won the national pistol shooting contest with both his left hand and with his right hand. It is also, you may forget all the things about this lecture today, but the one thing you're going to remember is, where did the phrase, shoot first, ask questions later come from? Two Gun Davis. So Leon Lewis goes in and starts telling him, here's my background, as an officer, blah, 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 blah. 2 minutes, and I've got these undercover operatives, 2 minutes into his talk, Police Chief Davis stops him. And I know this because there's a memo he wrote as soon as he got out of that office. And when I opened the box, I could feel the heat coming out of the box all those years later. He says, I'm talking to him, and 2 minutes into my talk, he says, stop. You don't get it. Hitler's only doing what he has to do to save Germany from the Jewish problem. And that in LA, the real threat is not Nazis and fascists. It's all those commies living in Boyle Heights, which is the eastern part of LA, and it's the Jewish neighborhood of the time. And he literally throws him out of the office, says, get out of here. So he goes to Sheriff Eugene Biscaluz. And Biscaluz, as you see here, gets a photograph signed by the Nazi consul to Los Angeles, Georg Gyssling, who he would go and have brunch with at least once a month. I know this because I interviewed Gissling's daughter. She gave me the photograph and told me, oh, they were such good friends. He then goes to the FBI and says, here's what's going on. And actually the LA agents are sympathetic, they say, but we can't do any undercover work unless we're authorized by J. Edgar Hoover. Well, guess what? J. Edgar Hoover, for those of you who don't know, major anti-Semite. Major anti-Semite, and even though he said, you can't authorize this, he had authorized them to tail Hollywood Reds, many of whom Jews, but people like Charlie Chaplin were being surveyed since the 1920s. So Leon Lewis feels, what am I going to do? I have to keep continuing the operation because these are dangerous people and no one wants to listen. No one wants to listen. So he continues running it. The problem is he is now losing every one of his clients because he's so obsessed with running a spy operation that he can't pay attention to his business. He has a wife and 2 small children, and he writes a memo in November 1933 saying, if I can't get money, I'm going to have to shut everything down. I have no more clients. I have no money coming in. How am I going to support my family? Well, in a last desperate attempt, remember, this is the man who has been dealing with the Hollywood head since 1915. The first person he goes to is Irving Thalberg, the boy genius at MGM. Thalberg is also not only creative in terms of cinema, he's the largest, most successful fundraiser for Jewish causes in LA. He then goes to 3 men. He goes to Irving Thalberg. He goes on the left, Rabbi Edgar Magnin, who is the rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, which is the most important temple in LA. It's the temple that all the Jewish studio heads went to, all the Jewish actors went to, etc., etc. And finally, he goes to the most important of the 3 men, Mendel Silberberg. Now, just quick, is there anyone here who knows, who has ever heard the name Mendel Silberberg? Have any of you heard Lew Wasserman? Imagine Lew Wasserman on steroids. That's Mendel Silberberg. Mendel Silberberg was the first great entertainment attorney in the United States. By the early 30s, he represented almost all the studios as their attorney. He represented basically every Jewish studio head. He represented most of the Jewish actors in Hollywood. And as people who I interviewed who worked with him said, when Mendel called, you dropped everything and listened. He's one of those people who speaks very softly, but expects you to do whatever he tells you to do. Mendel Silberberg said, continue doing what you're doing, we'll fund you, we'll get the money. And he contacts the 40 most prominent studio heads, producers, and a few directors, and tells them, show up to Hillcrest Country Club on March 1st, I think it was March 1st, 1934. And that evening, it was like a red carpet event without the red carpet. 40 limousines pull up, and as the 40 men, there were no women, as the 40 men get out, they are brought into a private dining room, where in front of them are copies of the Silver Ranger magazine, which is the magazine put out by the Silver Shirts. And as they look through, they see pages like this. And by the way, these pages here, boycott the mute movies, Hollywood, Vice, dope, sex. All these were also made into stickers, and they were put on buildings and telephone poles throughout the city. Now, Leon Lewis has worked with these men for many years, and he knows none of them, forget about being Jewish, they're not going to give you money just because you're a fellow Jew. And what he decides is he's going to frighten them into generosity. And he begins by telling them, you all pay attention to your above-the-line personnel. That is, all those names you see at the beginning of the movie, the writer, the director, the stars, the producer. But you're paying no attention to any of your bottom-of-the-line personnel. And in the months that my spies have been working, what they've discovered is virtually every studio foreman is not a Jew, and they're either sympathetic to the Bund or to the Silver Shirts, and they are systematically firing every Jew in the studios. He turns to Louis B. Mayer. Louis, you have one Jew left under the line. Harry Cohn, you got none left. And he goes around the room telling them how many Jews are left in there below the line. And I'm sure that concerns them, but then he delivers the punchline. He says, my spies have also uncovered a hit list, and your names are on that list. At the end of the evening, he walks out with $24,000 in 1934 money, which I just checked out is about $464,000 in 2020 dollars. That's a significant amount of money to run the operation. Leon Lewis basically gives up his practice and runs this for all those years. Here was some of the hit list men: Louis B. Mayer, Emanuel Cohn, Harry Cohn, Jack Warner. Well, it's a good thing they got the money, because over the next few years, what they discover is Nazis are making plans, because LA is an open port. That is, New York, as many of you know, during that period, the mayor of New York was Fiorello LaGuardia, who was a rabid anti-Nazi. In part, something I didn't know until I started this book, his mother was Jewish. So certain circles, LaGuardia is a Jew. And his father wasn't Catholic, he was Protestant. Unusual, Italian Protestant. But apparently he had made a deal with both the mob and the longshoremen, who were kind of close together, saying, look, we will turn a blind eye to what you're doing on the docks as long as you make sure no German spies get in, no German money gets in, and no German propaganda. We want you to tear every German boat apart. Well, the Nazis just changed their strategy, and they sent everything through the port of LA. How do I know this? Because I have all the spy reports talking about going on German vessels where they see money being handed over, they see orders with that red wax stamp on it, and they see propaganda being sent in. And so Nazis are now planning, they have open access to LA, they are planning to blow up military facilities all along Southern California. They're going to blow up the aircraft factories because LA would become the largest producer of airplanes in the country. They also have a plot to drive through Boyle Heights with a machine gun, killing as many Jews as possible. Another plot to create a phony fumigation company that would do real fumigation for Christians, but when they had a Jewish home, it would be cyanide pumped into there. But of all the plots, I want to talk just about two of them that are the most, I think, nefarious plots of all. His early four agents, three of the four, would testify early on at trials in 1934, trying to expose the Nazi plots. No one cared. All this sworn testimony came out. No one cared. The problem is, once he had his 3 spies testify, they were burned. And so he recruits another spy. And again, all Christians who, even though they knew Leon Lewis was a Jew, never felt they were working for the Jews. They were working for America. That's what they said over and over again. Chuck Slocum, born in Oakland, raised in Long Beach, California. He goes to, he joins the Ku Klux Klan. And after joining the Ku Klux Klan, he decides that, I don't really like this. The Klan hates everyone. I hate communists, but I don't hate everyone. I only hate the Klan. I don't hate blacks. I don't hate Jews. He goes to work for Leon Lewis, and he becomes his main spy. And here is a man who loses every one of his friends, and yet never tells them what he's really doing, because they all think, how can you be still a member of the Klan? He rises up to become the head recruiter for all of Southern California for the Klan, and he's the Klan's liaison to the Nazis, who by 1936 now call themselves, to sound more American, they change it from the Friends of New Germany to the German-American Bund. And he discovers a plot very early on in September 1935. Ingram Hughes, a failed attorney who worked as a linotype operator for many years at the LA Times, writes up this proclamation and has his friends at the LA Times insert it early Sunday morning into every Sunday LA Times. And when Angelinos picked up their Sunday paper that day, out came this proclamation. And the only thing that's worth saying here, because it's a long proclamation, that I'm calling upon all honest, true American Christians to finally help me enact and he calls it the final solution to the Jewish problem that cannot be solved through legislation alone. And his final solution was he was going to get a group of Nazis and fascists together. They were going to kidnap 20 of the major Hollywood figures, 20 of the major Jewish figures, some of them Hollywood figures like Busby Berkeley, who, again, I didn't know Busby Berkeley was Jewish until I started looking at this. But they know Leon Lewis. They're going after him. They're going after Mendel Silberberg. They're going after many of the judges and business leaders with the idea, what Ingram Hughes is saying to Chuck Slocum is, if we do this and succeed, our plan is we're going to kidnap all 20. We're bringing them out to a distant park far away. We're going to have machine guns with us. And while we hang them, while they're hanging and dangling, dying slowly, we're going to machine gun their bodies until we can separate their trunk from the rest, have the bottom drop to the ground. We'll then call the newspapers and have them go to that park in the morning. And he said, this is going to lead to bloodbaths throughout America. Well, Slocum tells Leon Lewis about it, and Leon Lewis says, you got to convince him that there's a spy inside. Because, in fact, both the Nazis and the fascists know about Leon Lewis through police Captain Red Hines, who's in charge of the LA Red Squad, who tells them in general what Lewis is doing, and in return the Nazis give him information about the communists. The only thing he never did was give them the names of the spies. So they knew Lewis was the man who was giving them all this trouble. And so Slocum said, look, we know there's somebody inside our group who's a spy. And if we do this, they're going to nail us, and we're going to go either the death penalty or we could be in jail for the rest of our lives. Let's postpone this. We're going to do it, but let's postpone it till we catch the spy. Well, they never did. But 2 years later, an even more likely plot to occur was launched by Captain Leopold McLaglan, the wayward brother of Oscar winner Victor McLaglan. And Leopold had been a member of the British Army in the Boer War. He fought in World War I. He's the man scrunched down there on your left. He is somewhere between 6'6" and 6'8". Now, many times you wonder, are these just a lot of hot air? Really, do any of these Nazis know what they're doing? Well, he is the world's jiu-jitsu champion. He has been traveling the world, both doing exhibitions, but also teaching jiu-jitsu to the French Sûreté and to Scotland Yard, on top of which he publishes 4 books on how to kill in hand-to-hand combat. 2 with how to kill with bayonets, 2 how to just simply kill your victims. He is a major anti-Semite, and he enters into an agreement with 2 of the leading fascists in Los Angeles. Henry Allen, who was the first family of fascists. His mother was his wife was the head of the Italian fascists. His son was thrown out of middle school for trying to organize junior high silver shirts. He also carried in his car wherever he went. If you can look on the left there, near the door, there's like a little handle. That's a plastic handle, and at the bottom is a 2x4 piece of wood that he called his kite killer. And one day Slocum describes how he pulls off the side of the road and says, "Let me show you how to use a kite killer." And he has Slocum stand next to him, and he says, what you do is you grab the handle and you shove the wood into the kite's stomach as hard as you can. And when he bends over, you take it and you hit him over the head until you hear the skull crack, and then get the hell out of there. The other person he's with is Ken Alexander, who is the head, both a very successful Hollywood photographer who hated everyone he worked with because they were Jews, and he's the head of the local Silver Shirts. And the 3 of them come up with a plot, working with Hermann Schwinn, who is now the leader of the Nazis in LA, and the second most powerful Nazi in the United States. And those men conspire that they are now going to target 24 major Hollywood figures, 24 Jews, studio heads, producers, directors, and 2 actors who were known to be too friendly to the Jews, Charlie Chaplin and James Cagney, who many of you may not have known. While he worked in New York in furniture stores, learned to speak Yiddish and was fluent in Yiddish, a good Irishman. Anyway, in this plot, instead of hanging them, they are going to work with the White Russians, the Silver Shirts, members of the German-American Bund, and once again, Gestapo on German ships. They were going to plant bombs at the 24 homes, and on the day, specific time, all those bombs would be set, and they would blow up the 24 homes. They also had men in LA port in speedboats who were going to, with machine guns, that if they saw any Jews trying to leave the port, they're going to take those speedboats, go out and kill them. Well, again, this is somebody who had led military operations, who had killed, who had taught how to kill, and I don't think it was just idle words. The problem is Chuck Slocum was one of the inner circle. And Chuck Slocum goes and tells Leon Lewis what's up, and Leon Lewis says, look, we're not going to blow the whistle on the murder plot because part of the plotters are members of the sheriff's department and the police department. And I'm going to play the long game. If I embarrass them now, I'll never have any valence with them. But if I keep shut and go to them and tell them I have this information, but next time I need a favor, I want that favor. So they do arrest McLaglan, but they arrest him because he is teaching jiu-jitsu to a millionaire in Santa Barbara, who he then turns around and tries to blackmail. And so he's brought up on extortion charges. He also breaks into the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League headquarters, trying to blame it on communists. But eventually, he is sentenced to 5 years in prison for extortion. But the judge says to him, I will suspend the sentence if you take the next boat back to England. Well, apparently his brother was in the back of the room, races out, buys him a one-way ticket to Liverpool, and the next day, Leopold McLaglan is gone. But the last story I want to tell you, and another kind of film noirish aspect, is the Nazi who was no Nazi. If you've watched any of the Amazon Prime series, what was it now? I always forget the name.
Man in the High Castle?
No, the other one. He is the villain, and he has been the villain of Hollywood historiography for years. He is sent by Goebbels and Hitler to LA because for Goebbels and Hitler, actually Los Angeles was the most important city in America, not just because of the open ports, but because Los Angeles was the capital of Hollywood. And both of them, Hitler used to watch a movie every night before he went to bed, and they both believed that one of the reasons Germany lost World War I was because of the effect of propaganda coming out of Great Britain and out of Hollywood. And he was committed to making sure that Hollywood would make no anti-Nazi film. He wanted to build up his support and prevent Hollywood from doing anything to stop him. So in the summer, around May, slightly before the summer of 1933, he sends Georg Gyssling to Hollywood with one assignment: make sure that there are no anti-German, anti-Hitler, or anti-Nazi images that come out of the studios. And he is very good at his job. He comes armed with the German import law of 1931 that says any studio that makes a film that in any way insults, deprecates, or mocks a German leader or the German nation will have all its films banned in Germany. And if enough of these films come out of any one nation, the entire nation's output will be banned. And this is a pretty serious threat because Germany is the second largest market for American film during those years. Britain is the largest, Germany the second. We have the reverse of what we have today. In those years, 70% of the box office came from national production, domestic box office, 30 international. Now it's, I think, pretty much 30% domestic and 70 international. But losing the German market would have been a very difficult thing. And, being Jewish is Jewish, but business is business. And everyone but the Warner Brothers basically caved in. And then the next year, they didn't have a choice at all because Hollywood passed the production code. And Article 10 of the production code stated that any studio, that no film, if you wanted a production code seal, no film could mock, denigrate, or in any way attack a foreign nation or its leader. If you did not have a production code seal, you could not get into first-run movie theaters. And because 70 to 80% of your profit was made in first-run movie theaters, people capitulated and they agreed. No films would be made until Confessions of a Nazi Spy in April 1939. And that was done only because it was based on a true story of a trial. The problem is, Georg Gyssling isn't who he seemed to be. And I have to tell you, when I was doing my research, and I'm reading about this man who had gone to a gymnasium for high school in Switzerland to study ancient languages, Sanskrit, Greek, etc. He had then gotten a JD degree where he actually had to write the equivalent of a PhD thesis. It wasn't just 3 years and you get your JD. He was, when he came to LA, he was considered the best dancer in the city, the most cultured person in the city. He spoke, I think, 6 or 7 languages. And I had read, because I wanted to know about what non-Jewish LA thought of this man, I read the LA Times social column from 1933 till he left in 41. And everyone's slobbering over him, and he's so sophisticated and so cool. And I'm thinking, I'm sorry, he can't be a Nazi. There's no way he can be a Nazi. And he reminded me of my father-in-law, who had left Germany in 1933. He had been in medical school and was thrown out of medical school by Hitler, went to Padua for a year, was thrown out of medical school by Mussolini, and eventually wound up at Northwestern. And as I got to know him many years later, he would always walk around his home humming German songs, opera, reciting German poetry, particularly Goethe, his favorite. And one day I said to him, Kurt, how can you have such a love for Germany after what Hitler did? And he said, I'm not going to let Hitler have a double victory. He's not going to have murdered all those Jews and then murder German culture for me. German culture has been there for hundreds and hundreds of years ahead of Hitler. It'll be there afterwards. I'm not going to let him do that. And I thought, this man's a German nationalist, but he's not a Nazi. And so I was gathering all this evidence and tried to track down his daughter who had been born here, and eventually did. And once I talked to her, the true story came out. The first thing she said when I walked, by the way, I did correspondence to make sure this was on the up and up. I had enough evidence, but nothing connecting it. And when I walked into her home, she said, thank God you're here. Somebody's going to finally learn the true story of my father. Well, the true story is starting in 1933, he had met at some point German-born Julius Klein, and the two of them became friends. And in fact, Gyssling was working for the downfall of Hitler. His friends were the plotters who tried to assassinate him later on. And starting in 1933, he was passing information on to Julius Klein about the German economy, German military, etc., etc. Well, Klein, in turn, started spying with his nephew, Joe Roos, on Nazis in Chicago, where both of them lived. It came to the attention, Julius Klein was working at a reporter then for the Chicago Trib, whose publisher happened to be the head of the National Guard for all of Illinois. And when he found out that Julius Klein and Joe Roos were spying, he called Joe, who worked for him, into the office and said, tell me what's going on. And when he told him, he said, you and your uncle are incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. You're going to die. And he said, I have somebody I want you to talk to. It's a military man here. Here's a hotel room. I have called him up. Show up at this hotel this day, this time. And he shows up and he tells the colonel what was going on. And the colonel says, same thing. You're courageous, but you're going to die. I want you to get trained by my counterintelligence people. And so for several weeks, Joe Roos is trained by the counterintelligence people in how to avoid detection, how to go into hotel rooms, how to go into apartments without being seen, how to jump into big holes, even if they're like 5, 10 feet deep, if you have to run away. And he is trained. And who's the man who trains him? You may have heard his name, George C. Marshall. Well, the big moment comes in January 1940. Gyssling happens to be in Washington, D.C., because the German government has called in 6 of the major councils, plus the major military leaders, German leaders in America, and they have a secret meeting at the German embassy in D.C. As he's walking in the Mayflower Hotel, who does he run into but Julius Klein? And Klein says, what's going on? And he says, I can't talk to you now. There are too many eyes. I'm going to be stopping in Chicago on my way back to Los Angeles. Let's meet at a hotel. They meet at a hotel 2 weeks later, and Gyssling gives him the entire military plan of the German government that they had discussed at that secret meeting. Well, back to Los Angeles. George Gyssling and his daughter leave, Angelica leave, when FDR gets rid of all the German diplomats. They're ordered to leave in June. He leaves finally in July 1941. So now I want to jump to December 8th, 1941, and the day after Pearl Harbor. And if you go on an FBI website, you can actually find all the arrests hour by hour, day by day, city by city on their website for post-Pearl Harbor. And when I went on, I discovered, in fact, it was very impressive that the FBI had rounded up all these Nazis and fascists and Japanese agents within 48 hours, all the major people in LA rounded up, except for one thing that bothered me. When I got Hermann Schwinn, the #2 Nazi in America, when I got his Freedom of Information Act file, it started in January 1942. Well, if it started in January 1942, how did they know who to arrest? Well, every September, Joe Roos, who was the literary partner in the two, would write up a long memo that he would send to Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, and the FBI, listing every single Nazi and fascist in LA, the groups they belonged to, and he divided them into three categories: highly dangerous, dangerous, keep under surveillance. Well, when I looked at the FBI lists, they had sent the FBI agents and police in LA a list that had Group A, B, C, start with the A, who are most highly dangerous. And when I looked at the list, they were exact same list that Leon Lewis and Joe Roos had sent. But I didn't have the evidence, so I went to the National Archives, and of course, literally on the last day, just fishing, I got a bite, and I found the document. And what the FBI had done is they typed up Joe Roos's last report, retyped it, claimed it as their own, submitted it, instead of saying highly dangerous, dangerous, keep on, they simply called it ABC, and they took all the credit, never acknowledging Leon Lewis or anyone like this. But I have to tell you that for Leon Lewis and Joe Roos, they didn't care. As long as the job was done, it was all right with them. Well, Lewis is an unknown hero who never received anything, any notice or medals other than this one Americanism Award from the American Legion in June 1939. And now just the last part, the final link, and here's where, if we have any film scholars, here's something for you to look at, which is during the war, somewhere around 43, 44, Leon Lewis pulls together a group of Hollywood figures and asks Walter Wanger to chair it, that they called the Motion Picture Americanism Committee. And what Lewis is saying to them is the war is going to end, and when the war ends, we're going to have to make peace with Germany and Japan. We need to start writing films now that have a positive message about democracy for the future. And part of that committee was Wanger, Dory Sherry, Joe Mankiewicz, but rather than, they do some positive stuff, but many of them will, I think, later reflect on what's gone on all those years and what's gone in a city that we are walking those streets, that's what we see, and nobody cares. Well, Leon Lewis would go down, until the book, no one really knew about him, and more to the point, nobody knew about his spies. And while this is a conference on film noir, I think there's actually a larger message here, which is we see what happened on January 6th, 2021. And people like Leon Lewis and the men and women who worked for him, the wives, risked their lives. And without ever shooting a bullet, without ever picking up arms, they defeated a whole range of enemies that were bent on first starting with the Jews, then it would be the blacks, and then it would be other minorities and people of color. And as I said, what struck me is even though they knew this was an operation run by a Jewish lawyer, funded by the Hollywood moguls, they never felt that this was a Jewish crusade. They argued this is an American crusade. And what they had said is that in America, when one group calls for death to another group, it is the obligation of every single American citizen, regardless of your race, your religion, your ethnicity, to stand up and protect every other American. And as end by paraphrasing Leon Lewis, only in a nation where people accept one another because of their differences, not despite their differences, can we ever achieve the true realization of the American democratic dream. Thank you. We have time for, I said I'd be over in 50 minutes, so we have time for questions, answers. For questions, I can't promise answers.
Why isn't more of the information that you've given us out in the open? I don't know anybody who knows any of this information.
As I've tried to explain, my generation of historians, new left historians who were in graduate school in the 70s, we were all focusing on communists and anti-communists. We made an assumption because Germany lost the war, Nazism and fascism couldn't have been a real threat, but we know everyone's obsessed about the communist threat. So rather than write the history of fascism in America, we were writing the history of communist and anti-communist activity. And it's only been in the last few years that a number of historians have really started to look deeply at this history. And I would say, I've tried to get some of my students, I think it is the most underwritten, important aspect of American history, which is the fascist history of this country that, as we know, has gone on to today. And what is truly frightening, I'm trying to write a follow-up that takes the story from 1945 to today. And what is frightening is that all these people, including the Nazis, portray themselves as patriots. We are saving America from the X-Menace. Just fill in whatever the X is. In the same way, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, what you have to understand, you can't just call them hate groups, they're patriots. In their own mind, many of us are the enemy, and they are saving America. They are the true successors of Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, and all these people who were great American patriots.
I would just add to that the insidiousness of the institutionalized support they had. You talked about two-gun and then all the police institutions that were supporting the Nazis. Even now, when you're talking about the Proud Boys and some of that stuff that's going on now, we're not hearing that there's that much complicity between the institutions of state and those groups. I don't know if it's true or not, but you've certainly illuminated that here.
Yeah, did you all hear what the question was? Basically, that there is enormous complicity, that what we also haven't heard is the complicity with state agencies that consistently turned a blind eye. I can't speak, I'm not up in my research to today yet. I can talk to you through the 70s. But even then, I can tell you one of the people I'm looking at is James Maydall, who is the founder of the National Renaissance Party. So here are my parents coming from Auschwitz and Dachau, moving to New York, living in the Lower East Side until they save up enough to move to Queens. And then I asked my mother, and she said, no, we never ventured there. But starting around 1951, 52, if you showed up on 86th or 88th Street and York Avenue, you would be seeing James Maydall surrounded by stormtroopers and his Nazi cohorts giving Nazi speeches on the streets of New York through into the 1970s. And the undercover agents' reports I'm getting are saying, well, some of the police are against him, but many of the police, as one of my spies says, after Maydall's speech, the police captain came over, shook his hand, and said, "You're a great American, sir." So throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, I know there's a great deal of complicity with state forces. And I can tell you to this very day, in LA, our sheriff's department, police have tried to be more, I think the police have been more successful in reform, but in the sheriff's department, you still have, I would say, people who are linked. I have no hard evidence, but people who are not unsympathetic to some of the hate groups in this country.
I live in Los Angeles, and I've lived there all my life, and so I'm familiar with some of the people that you talked about. I'm curious, what caused you, coming from the 70s and being interested in the communist, anti-communist, blackness, etc., what caused you you become interested in this particular chapter in LA history? And also, I want to point out that a few years ago, we had a sheriff in Los Angeles named Sherman Block, who was actually a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting fact. But I'm just curious what caused you to revert to this type of scholarship rather than the other.
Well, I was writing a book called Hollywood Left and Right, How Movie Stars Shaped American Politics, and I wrote about Edward G. Robinson, who because I try to differentiate between different kind of political activism, and I talk about him as being one of the early originators of what I call issue-oriented politics. That is, movie stars who don't want to spend their life in movement politics, but are happy to endorse and support and speak out for certain issues. And he was an important member of the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League that was formed in the spring of 1936. And I wanted to find out more about how did movie stars leverage their celebrity. And so I got online, I Googled Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, and up popped a exhibit from Cal State Northridge, which is about 40 minutes from where I live in West LA. And it was called In Our Own Backyard, Nazis and Fascists in Los Angeles. I knew nothing about this, but it said we have this huge collection, and I went online, and sure enough, they had boxes on the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. But it was like 300 plus boxes overall, and even the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League was about 10 or a dozen boxes. It was too much for one page. But I thought, this is great stuff. I know nothing about this. I want to go back and see. And I was telling some people right before the talk, I went back after I finished Hollywood Left and Right, and for 4 weeks I was working in the archives, and I had no idea what the story was, because remember, Leon Lewis is running until 1945. He runs this out of his office, his law office, 3-room law office in the Roosevelt Building, downtown LA. Nice place to be doing it, the Roosevelt Building. And he was afraid that because the Nazis knew where he was, and they actually posted someone outside, either Nazis or the Silver Shirts had someone posted outside his office every day to see if anyone they knew walked in that building. Because if one of their members walked in the building, that was the spy. So he never had anything in his office that was a code that told you who was what and what was going on. And it wasn't until I found out Joe Roos, his associate spy master, had his archives at USC, and that part of it, the first thing I looked at was his unpublished manuscript about the spy operation, naming the names, the code names, and all of a sudden it was like, now I get it, and I can't tell you how excited I was. I never got a present in my life that was better than that moment when suddenly you think, oh my God, I know what this story is, and it's unbelievable.
As you know, Joe Kennedy was a mini Hollywood tycoon. Did his experience in Hollywood influence why he was so pro-German during World War II?
I just think some people are born bad. Joe Kennedy was just a nasty piece of work. No one in Hollywood liked him. He didn't fit into the story at all, other than trying to get Louis B. Mayer to be more and more leaning towards the Germans. And even if you have to hold your nose, Louis, this is where the future is. And as far as Joe was concerned, he would have rather have us ally with Germany against the Soviet Union.
There's a place called Cantor in Brentwood, Riviera area. I grew up doing Boy Scouts up there. My mom used to tell me that there were Nazi cells that lived there during World War II. I was curious if you had ever heard of this.
Yep, I write about it. Murphy Ranch is what it was known as. The camp is later on. In 1933, there's a couple known as the Stevens, who are both very wealthy. Husband mining money, I forget with the wife, but multimillionaires. They come under the influence of a German only known as Herr Schmidt. Herr Schmidt says he is a Svengali type, that he can read the future. And when I first heard this, I thought, oh yeah, right. Except what Herr Schmidt said is, I foresee that there will be a war in Europe and in the Far East. Hitler will conquer all of Europe. Japan will conquer all of the Far East, and the two of them will join together to conquer all of America, at which point Hitler will take over oversight of America. But he will need to speak with the Japanese leaders, and since LA is roughly halfway between Berlin and Tokyo, we're going to build, I'm calling it the Western White House. We're going to build a compound for Hitler here that will be command headquarters. And they hire an architect who draws up the initial plans for a 33-bedroom, self-contained compound that will have its own meat locker, its own water supply, an electric fence that goes around the entire building. They will have swimming pool, meeting halls, everything you need to be totally isolated. And in order to get there, I took Dana Goodyear, the New Yorker reporter, down to visit, and I told her in advance, I said, Dana, make sure you wear really comfortable shoes. I mean, really comfortable, because we're going to go down, 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 down. And when we're done, we're going to have to go up, up, up. And we hit a 90-degree day. It was a rough day. But there's still some of that has survived. The irony, of course, is they didn't like the original plans, and apparently in 2020 dollars, they spent several $1 million just building some of it. Some of it is already built. And then they hired the man who is considered one of the great architects in LA, Paul Williams, to come up with a new set of plans, and those plans are at UCLA, except they went on Paul Williams' name. No one ever bothered in the Nazi community to discover that Paul Williams was an African American. So, I mean, great irony there. It's a tourist site today. I mean, there's no camp anymore, but yes, it is a tourist site.
Houses with the graffiti and
Yeah, that was, some people say it was the powerhouse. I think it was, in fact, the caretaker's home.
it doesn't look like
No, it doesn't look like power. It looks like somebody's home or whatever, yeah. So it's still there, and it's still full of graffiti, and it's interesting.
I think, and I think many others think, that the real threat today, comparable to that threat then, is the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel feeling on all American college campuses. How do we deal with that?
Well, I think you're exaggerating, because, you know, everyone, you're going to find any kind of sentiment on any campus about anything. And I think the best way to deal with it is through education. That's why I run a Jewish Studies Center that we try to do works on anti-Semitism. We try to do, I've just run a series of 3 events, and if you Google the Kasdan Institute, you can get, and I urge you to do this for the last of the 3, we've been running, I'm partnering with colleagues at UCLA, we've been running a 3-part series called Deadlock, Israel, Palestine, Thinking of a Way Future, and we have pulled together for each of these sessions, the first 2, 4 people, 2 Israelis, 2 Palestinians, all of whom disagree with each other about everything, except agree on one thing: we need to move the peace process forward. And the 3rd one, we just had a few weeks ago, was Yossi Beilin and Hiba Husseini, who have presented to the UN Secretary General and to the U.S. Ambassador a 2-state confederation solution. Yossi Beilin has been the chief Israeli negotiator since the Oslo Accords, and Hiba Husseini has been one of the chief Palestinian negotiators since the 90s. And the 2 of them got so fed up with the inactivity of their governments that they came up with a 2-state plan that, you know, it just, here are the options, here's what we do. That's what we can do at a university, which is simply to try to educate people in what's going on. If I had a real solution, I'd be running for president. Question?
Yeah, first of all, what happened to Gyssling?
Oh, that's a good question. What happened to Georg Gyssling? So Gyssling, the entire time Gyssling was in LA, because I hired somebody in Germany to go through the Foreign Office records and get all his files. And those files, and translate them, because I don't read German. And in there are letters from the leaders of the German-American Bund, from the time he comes there to the time he leaves, saying this guy isn't a Nazi. You haven't sent a real Nazi. He doesn't hate the Jews like we do. Yeah, he denounces them, but he doesn't doing it like the way we do. He's not really committed to anti-Semitism. The thing is, Hitler and Goebbels didn't care as long as he prevented Hollywood from making any film. They thought the Bund, by the way, were a bunch of clowns who were actually hurting Germany in many ways. The problem is when he gets back to Germany, and this is what his daughter told me, and I verified everything, because every daughter or son wants to think well of their parents, and it's the job of the historian to make sure that they haven't exaggerated it. She told me the first thing her father said to her is, I know they're going to interview me, and in fact they brought him to Gestapo headquarters for 3 nights. They're going to ask you questions. She was 13 at the time. Be a dumb teenager. You know nothing. You know nothing, just stupid. Whatever they ask you, I don't know, my dad, you know. They hold him over for 3 days. He's released, and he comes home and he tells her, we've got to get out of Berlin. It's only time till they arrest me. And he writes one of his friends who was running the, there was the movie about the counterfeiting ring, and was it The Counterfeiter, where they pulled Jews out of the camps to make 20-pound British notes. That's the man, Sven is running it. It's a friend of Gyssling. He calls him and says, can you get me out of Berlin? And he says, yes. And he writes officials, I need Georg Gyssling to help me. So he goes down there, and eventually he's made the consul for Murano, Italy. Well, while he's the consul, he enters into secret negotiations with 2 or 3 German generals who are meeting in Switzerland with Alan Dulles, who is the head of the OSS. And they arrange the surrender of German forces in northern Italy. And Gyssling is one of the people negotiating the surrender, but under no good deed goes unpunished. He's arrested afterwards, and he's sent to prison, and he is sent to Nuremberg, and he's rotting in a prison until the middle of 1947. And I found this on, for those of you who use Ancestry.com, there's a sibling site called Fold3, F-O-L-D 3, which is the military records. So I got into Fold3 and found a letter from then Brigadier General Julius S. Klein, because Klein stayed in touch with George Marshall his entire career. And Marshall kept promoting him. It's a letter from Brigadier General Klein, the highest ranking Jew in the army at that point, saying this is the one and only time I will ever write a personal reference for a Nazi, because Georg Gyssling is no Nazi. From the time I met him in 1933 until the time he left to go back to Germany, he had been feeding me information, all of which proved to be true, and all of which was sent to George Marshall and can be verified. He was then released. He then went to Spain, lived there until he died, and his daughter, who had remained in Germany for a long time, eventually met a lieutenant commander in Air Force intelligence, met him, moved to Morro Bay, California, and that's where I eventually interviewed her, I guess 2 years before her death. And I have to say, it felt very good to be able to, before this woman died, to know that the story, because she actually saw the book before she died, that the story of her father and his true heroism would finally be known. Felt very good to be able to do that. Yeah. Well, that's why, when Rob asked me to do this, I'm not a historian of film noir, but I thought, how do you get more film noir than some of this? But seriously, when I tell you about this Hillcrest meeting, here's what I'm going to say this as a joke, but I'm dead serious. It's the first time in thousands of years that Jews kept an important secret. There is not a single memoir. I've read a lot. I haven't read everything, but I've read a lot of Hollywood history. There is not a single memoir, and I tracked down, the major moguls who were all there. I tried to track down what, their autobiographies. No one ever says a word. More to the point, I couldn't get a hold of Leon Lewis's family, but I did get a hold of Joe Roos's son, who knew nothing about what his father had done. I got a hold of Chuck Slocum's daughter. She knew nothing about what her father had done. And part of it, and when Leonard Roos asked me, why do you think it is? I said, I'll tell you what I think. The Nazis had threatened all the spies. What they said is, if we find out somebody's a spy and they're working for the federal government, we're going to beat them within an inch of their life, but we're not going to kill them. Because after all, they're working for the government. We would do the same thing. But if they're working for the Jews, they're dead. And I will tell you, 3 of Leon Lewis's spies died under very suspicious circumstances. And I'm pretty sure one of them was killed, for sure, poisoned. Another one, Neil Ness, who was his second most important spy, died because the police refused to get him. They found him drunk. He had hit the floor. He had a major concussion, and they refused to send them to the hospital until it was too late. And these police were all part of the Silver Shirts. They all knew him because he had testified before Congress, before HUAC. And a third one who died also under suspicious circumstances. And I think no parent wanted to tell a child that, and they also said, we'll get your family. No parent wanted to tell a child that because of what I've done, your life might be in danger. Better to have them live in ignorance and not know. Stomach. The week before, it was John Schmidt. The week before, he was supposed to go testify in Washington at a trial, sedition trial. He got incredibly ill and out of nowhere died. It would have been, I'd have to read my own book. I'm going to guess 44, somewhere around there, 43, 44.
I just was there briefly, you're talking about Hollywood history, and I noticed that one of the books on the reading list in here is Kirk Douglas's autobiography.
Yeah.
And his story, which, if you've seen the movie Trumbo, whether that's historically accurate, fundamentally really highlights what Kirk Douglas's courage.
Yeah, but Kirk Douglas is a different story. He's breaking the blacklist. Yeah. He's not involved in the anti-fascist activities at this point.
Yeah, Steve, thank you so much for this. And I think it's a major motion picture. How's your agent doing with your book?
Well, here's what I will tell you.
I have a question, though. So.
Okay, it is signed by a studio, but to use the Pauline Kael line, Hollywood is the only place you can die of encouragement. Everyone's deal is closed, the writer, the producer, the star, but not my deal, and so I can't say anything until that's closed. But I think it will get closed, and it will be, they've got a major star, and I just want this on the screen because I want Americans to know this story.
Absolutely, but I do have a question.
Sure.
Because what stuck out for me was the American Labor Party, knowing your working class Hollywood book. Can you explain how or why, in particular, the American Labor Party is?
It's not the Communist American Labor Party. It's the Nazi American Labor Party. They both adopt the same name. And I had the same thing, Jane. When I first looked at it, I said, what are the Reds doing with the Nazis? And then I realized, no, they just took the same name out of National Socialist Workers' Party. So instead of calling it the American Workers' Party, they call it the American Labor Party. But it was totally Nazi. Not even fascist, Nazi, pure Nazis.
What happened to
Leon Lewis stayed on for another year and then was just tired and went back into private practice. And around it's either 1953, 1954, was driving home on Pacific Coast Highway and had a heart attack and died at the wheel. Oh, we're going to cut this off now. Wait, one last question. Okay.
In the presentation, you presented Marshall as a good guy. But if I recall, Marshall told Truman not to recognize Israel.
Well, all I could tell you is in 1933, Marshall was a really good guy. What happens later on, I don't know enough to talk about, but in 33, he really went out of his way. And in fact, it was Joe Roos who, once he took over, really changed the spy craft and actually taught the spies how to spy. And so he, in terms of this, he had a major impact. And he turned to Julius Klein for the rest from the 30s until through 1950s to help him with psychological warfare. So, and Klein would eventually go on to create his own various agencies. And at one point, Julius Klein was a undersecretary of commerce. So he was a player in the government as well. And Marshall was good to the Jews then. So that's all I can tell you. Anyway, thank you all for coming out today.